Rick Boone crouched next to the towering iron vault, methodically boring holes in seemingly nonsensical patterns. The corroded surface wailed under the pressure of his drill, decades of rust giving way to precise perforations that, to an onlooker, appeared random, yet they obeyed a secret design known only to him. His rough, calloused fingers moved with the delicacy of a surgeon, gauging distances using a strange wooden instrument of his own crafting. The Granger family had nearly split their sides laughing the day Rick exchanged real money for what they dubbed junkyard trash. Even Clyde Baxter, the man who sold it, had warned him off the deal, swearing up and down the old vault was worthless and beyond saving. Still, Rick had calmly laid out a stack of silver coins, his expression one of quiet resolve, as if he were privy to a hidden truth. Now, just 3 days later, his workshop buzzed with mysterious deliveries. Coils of copper tubing that shimmered like minted coins, jars and vials of all shapes and sizes, tiny metal cogs no bigger than marbles, flexible rubber hoses he inspected with the keen eye of a diagnostician. To most, the assortment seemed a jumble of unrelated odds and ends. But Rick positioned each piece with the sureness of someone assembling a grand design. Rebecca Granger had begun finding reasons to pass by his place more often, her curiosity burning like a fire she couldn't put out. What sort of invention could require a broken vault and such bizarre components? Her father, Virgil, dismissed Rick as a lunatic chasing fanciful notions. But Rebecca saw something else, the unwavering gaze of a man completely certain of his purpose. Strangest of all was Rick's silence. He never offered a word of explanation, not even when neighbors stopped to question him. He'd simply offer a polite nod and return to his enigmatic tinkering, his focus unshakable. The safe's heavy door hung ajar like the gaping jaws of some ancient beast, exposing an interior Rick had stripped bare and was now reconstructing using components no one could begin to name. Inside that rust-eaten shell, something unfamiliar was beginning to emerge. Yet whatever it was remained hidden in mystery, just as the valuables once secured within had been. Rick Boone had first laid eyes on the safe one bright morning, just as Clyde Baxter was wrangling it with a pair of mules and a length of thick rope. The massive iron relic had been abandoned behind the general store for months, an eyesore and a reminder of a failed venture long forgotten. Rust had overtaken it completely, and the locking mechanism hadn't turned in years. Passers-by barely noticed it anymore, their eyes sliding past it like it wasn't even there. Rick approached slowly, letting his coarse fingers glide across the flaking metal, as if deciphering messages only he could comprehend. The structure rose to his chest and stretched out twice as wide, its immense bulk sunk firmly into the soil. What drew Rick's interest wasn't the obvious decay, but rather the soundness that still lay beneath it. The integrity of its build whispered to him through the years of wear. "Don't bother with that heap," Clyde called out, mopping sweat from his brow. "Been trying to move it for 3 months now. Figured I'd drag it out to the ravine and let it rot there, just dead weight." But Rick continued to study the relic, slowly circling it as if measuring its soul. His mind was already churning with ideas that would have sounded absurd to anyone else. He wasn't seeing rust or damage, he was seeing purpose, possibility. "How much you asking for it?" Rick asked, voice low and calm. Clyde paused mid-tug, rope slack in his hands. "You serious? That thing's nothing but rust and regret. Lock's been busted since before I got it. Door won't even shut right anymore." "How much?" Rick repeated. $10 and you haul it yourself," Clyde said, thinking he'd just swindled a fool, but not about to turn down easy cash. Without a word, Rick pulled out 10 silver coins and counted them into Clyde's hand. That evening, news of the bizarre transaction swept through the town like a prairie fire. The stranger, Rick Boone, had paid real money for Clyde's rusted-out old safe. At the Granger dinner table, the news came between bites of stew, and Virgil nearly spewed his coffee. $10? For that pile of junk? He roared, thumping the table with a wheezing laugh that sent the dishes rattling. "That man's either lost his mind or was born without one." "Maybe both," Virgil chuckled, still shaking his head. Rebecca tried to mask her grin behind her napkin, but the smile tugging at her lips betrayed her curiosity. What had Rick seen in that rusted hulk that everyone else had missed? Her brothers chimed in with more jokes, piling on mockery about the stranger foolish enough to spend hard-earned silver on what they considered scrap metal. But while the Grangers laughed over their supper, Rick was making quiet preparations for the safe's delivery the next morning. He moved with the deliberate calm of someone who knew he'd struck a rare deal, like a man who recognized treasure where others only saw trash. Let them scoff. Soon, they would see for themselves exactly what $10 had bought him. At first light, a wagon creaked its way up to Rick's property, drawn by 4 men and loaded with rope thick enough to tether the moon. The safe resisted every tug and pull, its sheer weight turning the job into a trial of muscle and patience. The men grunted and cursed as they strained, the wagon groaning under the burden, its axles groaning and toes narrowly spared. Rick stood on his porch, calmly sipping from a steaming mug, issuing instructions with the air of a man directing a familiar symphony. "Right there next to the shop," he called out, gesturing toward a patch of land he had cleared and leveled the night before. He had reinforced it with flat stones arranged to catch the golden beams of morning sunlight. The team wrestled the iron beast into place, finally setting it down with a bone-jarring thud in the exact spot Rick had envisioned. Once they left, their grumbles fading down the road, Rick began slowly circling the safe, hands tucked behind his back like a craftsman eyeing a blank canvas. For nearly an hour, he examined his acquisition from every side, running his fingers over patterns of corrosion, tapping on seams, checking the thickness of its iron skin. Each mark and groove seemed to tell him something no one else could hear. Whatever he discovered in that inspection left him deeply satisfied. Then the odd errands began. Rick made trip after trip into town, returning with materials that defied any logical connection to restoring an old safe. Shiny coils of copper tubing handled like fragile treasure, delicate glass containers each swaddled in cloth and cradled in his arms. Minuscule gears with craftsmanship so fine they might have come from a watchmaker's bench. Rolls of rubber hose he unspooled and examined as carefully as a surgeon inspecting surgical tools. Some of the metal fittings Rick began installing were so oddly specific, he had to place custom orders through the railroad supply depot. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the local boarding house, couldn't help but stare from her porch as he loaded his wagon with each new batch of strange materials. "What on earth are you putting together out there, Rick? Something practical, I hope?" she called out one morning, half laughing. Rick simply tipped his hat with his usual quiet charm and replied, "Something useful," before climbing into the seat and rolling away down the lane. Rebecca Granger had taken to riding by his place nearly every day. She told herself it was just to check the trails or clear her head, but deep down she knew it was the mystery that pulled her back. She'd caught glimpses of Rick at work through gaps in the trees, wielding tools she didn't recognize, grinding and cutting and aligning parts with the precise care of a jeweler setting a timepiece. The noises that escaped from his workshop were nothing like the pounding clangs of a smithy. Instead, they were crisp, delicate, like the whispers of machinery being born. What baffled her most were the changes he continued to make to the safe itself. The door now remained ajar, held in place by a simple wooden beam, exposing an interior that bore no resemblance to a vault. The thick walls that once protected fortunes were gone, replaced by an intricate weave of copper tubing and glass vessels. The layout was so deliberate, so perfectly fitted. It was clear that Rick was assembling something far more advanced than anyone could guess. Virgil Granger, driven by equal parts curiosity and skepticism, finally rode over one afternoon to see the so-called Lunatics project firsthand. Rick greeted him with a courteous nod and kept right on working, seemingly unfazed by the visitor. Virgil scanned the bizarre tangle of materials arranged around the safe. Despite his doubts, he couldn't help but ask, "So, what kind of contraption are you piecing together here?" Rick paused, wiped his hands clean on a rag, and looked up with a small smile. "Every worthwhile idea starts with someone being called crazy," he said softly. But what Rick was crafting wasn't just a good idea, it was something far more extraordinary. By the end of the second week, his mysterious undertaking had become the talk of the town. Each visit to the general store sparked fresh rounds of speculation. Everyone, it seemed, had a theory about what Rick Boone was constructing inside that old iron husk. The rumors ran the full spectrum, from clever to completely ridiculous, but none managed to capture the true intricacy of Rick's work. Nor did they explain the bizarre assortment of components he continued to haul back from town. Rebecca found herself drawn past his property more and more, always armed with some excuse for her path. What she noticed was that Rick worked in deliberate phases, never rushing, never jumping ahead. He completed one portion of his design before moving to the next with steady, calculated focus. Inside the iron shell, the copper tubing had now taken on a life of its own, curling into complex shapes and interlocking networks. The joints were so clean and precise they might have been the handiwork of a master plumber. But the real mystery lay in the gears, small, gleaming wheels Rick placed with obsessive accuracy. Each one connected to delicate arms that sprang to life when he spun a larger central wheel. They didn't just turn, they moved with a sense of purpose, triggering a sequence of reactions throughout the mechanism. It was one particular afternoon that finally pushed Rebecca past the point of silent observation. She watched as Rick filled a glass chamber with water and slowly poured it into the top opening of his device. As the liquid settled into place, the system came alive. The weight of the water activated the gears, which in turn rotated with deliberate timing, opening valves and redirecting flow through multiple copper pathways. Rubber hoses carried the water across various compartments, while the gear train controlled the balance of pressure and duration with astonishing accuracy. "Afternoon, Miss Granger," Rick called out, having clearly noticed her watching from the roadside. His voice was warm but guarded. "Good afternoon." "Rick, that's quite the contraption you've got there," she replied, feigning casual interest even as her gaze remained locked on the mesmerizing dance of cogs and channels. "Every challenge has its solution," Rick said simply, using his hand-carved measuring tool to fine-tune the alignment of a gear. "Sometimes you've just got to build the answer yourself." Rebecca longed to ask what challenge exactly could demand such a complex mechanical answer. But the look in Rick's eyes warned her he wasn't ready to explain. Not yet. So instead, she simply watched in silence as he adjusted gear ratios with incredible precision, each movement subtly shifting the dynamics of the entire system. By nightfall, word of Rick's latest demonstration had made its way back to the Granger ranch. Virgil, who once found the whole affair laughable, now simmered with irritation. Having a mad tinkerer for a neighbor was one thing, but a mad tinkerer who attracted attention from everyone in town was becoming a real thorn in his pride. Visitors kept asking about the strange machine taking shape nearby, forcing Virgil to admit that he hadn't the faintest clue what Rick was doing. "Man's gone clean off his rocker," he grumbled to his sons over their evening meal, "putting together some fancy-looking junk that won't amount to anything." But Rebecca hadn't forgotten the sharp intensity in Rick's eyes, the mathematical precision of his measurements, or the sheer ingenuity behind his design. This wasn't the work of a lunatic. This was engineering, refined, calculated, visionary. The real question was, what kind of problem called for such an intricate, gear-driven, self-regulating machine? And why was Rick so determined to keep it hidden behind polite smiles and vague answers? The boiling point came on a Wednesday morning. Virgil Granger, finally fed up with the attention Rick's project was drawing, saddled up with his sons. Their horses kicked up thick plumes of dust as they made their way toward Rick's property, moving with the arrogant confidence of men used to throwing their weight around. Rick was at his workbench, carefully tuning the gear array, making final adjustments to the control system that managed water flow and pressure with near-perfect automation. Dozens of rubber tubes snaked from the core of the machine, carrying water to various compartments, while miniature gears directed the timing and flow with a level of precision that rivaled fine clockwork. Small metal filters were mounted in exact positions, within easy reach of rotating arms designed to clean or replace them without interrupting the system. "Boone," came the booming voice of Virgil Granger, its commanding tone betraying the entitlement of a man used to being obeyed across the valley. "We need to have a word." Rick looked up from his task, expression steady and composed. "Morning, Virgil. What brings you by? You can start by telling me what in God's name you're building over here," Virgil said, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "People are showing up at my ranch asking about your project like I've got some part in it. Makes me look like I've lost control of what's going on in my own backyard." Rick didn't flinch. "It's not your backyard," he said softly, not confrontational, just stating a fact. "I paid for this land just like anyone else." That's when Marcus, Virgil's eldest, took a step forward, his posture tight with barely concealed hostility. "Doesn't matter whose name's on the deed," he growled. "What matters is you're turning us all into a joke with this insane setup of yours." Rick calmly returned to his adjustments, sliding his carved wooden tool between two brass gears and making a fine-tuned shift in alignment. "It's not insanity to fix a problem that hasn't been solved yet." "What problem exactly?" The voice came from behind them, clear, inquisitive, and unmistakably Rebecca's. She had arrived on horseback, her keen eyes having spotted the confrontation from afar. Now she sat astride her mare, posture straight, gaze locked on Rick. "What is it you're trying to fix?" she asked. For the first time in days, Rick set down his tools and stepped back from the machine. He looked at the intricate network of gears, valves, and pipes that now pulsed quietly with potential, then turned to the group watching him with a mix of suspicion and intrigue. "Clean water," he said. "Automatically, when you need it." The words fell into the silence like a stone dropped into a still pond. Virgil barked out a dry, incredulous laugh. "Water? Boy, we got a whole damn river running through this valley. Ain't nobody around here struggling to fill a bucket." Without a word, Rick walked to the edge of his workshop and picked up a tin cup from the barrel beside it. He dipped it into the stagnant, cloudy water and turned, holding it out to Virgil. "Then drink this," he said. Virgil took one look at the murky contents and recoiled. "Hell no. That water's been sitting out for weeks." "Exactly." Rick tipped the cup and poured the stagnant water directly into the intake valve of his machine. Almost instantly, the system stirred to life. Gears whirred into motion. Pressure chambers activated without a single manual adjustment, and the water was routed through a series of chambers via rubber tubing. Inside, layers of sand, charcoal, and smooth river stones filtered the liquid with surgical precision, while mechanical arms delicately tweaked the pressure and timing at every stage. From the spout at the end of the line came a stream of perfectly clear water, sparkling, clean, and flowing at a precisely regulated rate. It looked as pure as anything drawn from a mountain spring, but Rick wasn't finished. He reached for a large central wheel and gave it a deliberate turn. Instantly, the machine began shifting. Gears realigned themselves. Arms rotated to swap out filter elements. The system began cleaning and maintaining itself, all while continuing to deliver clean water without pause. The stillness that followed felt heavy, almost sacred. No one spoke, but everyone watching understood this was no ordinary demonstration. They had just witnessed something entirely new, far beyond a basic water filter. Marcus Granger stepped forward, unable to hide the awe on his face. His eyes followed the elegant choreography of metal and motion, the glimmer of water cascading without effort. The design was airtight, the execution flawless. But more than the brilliance of the invention, it was the consequences of such a thing that disturbed him. "This doesn't change a thing," Virgil muttered at last, though his voice had lost the bravado it carried earlier. "Just a highfalutin way to clean water. We've got the river and wells for that." But Rebecca saw through her father's forced indifference. She could hear the edge of worry in his tone. Clean water was valuable. Automatically clean water with no need for pumps, buckets, or manual upkeep was something else entirely. This wasn't just a clever invention. It was a shift in power. In a valley where resources defined influence, and water was often a battleground between prosperity and ruin, Rick's contraption could tip the scales. Rick turned another dial and the gears shifted again. The flow intensified, water surged faster, the filters adjusting seamlessly to maintain quality. "Wells dry up," he said in a low, steady voice. "Rivers cloud with mud. This keeps working, rain or drought, summer or frost." The words landed like a blow to Marcus's gut. He knew the truth of it. Every dry season, the Granger Ranch wrestled with poor water. Their herds sometimes refused to drink from the silty streams, and they'd lost cattle to diseases from tainted water more than once. An invention like this, one that guaranteed a steady supply of clean water, was worth more than gold to any rancher. "How much can it produce?" Rebecca asked, her mind already moving through calculations, her voice sharp with curiosity. "That depends," Rick replied, adjusting the gear ratios again. The output shifted before their eyes. "This setup handles enough for a large home. But scale it up. Larger gears, more chambers, and it can service much more. The framework is designed to grow." Virgil's face turned grim, shadows gathering beneath his furrowed brow. The full reality was setting in. This wasn't just some harmless hobby. It was a working solution to one of the most critical challenges in the region, built by a man no one had taken seriously. If Rick could offer clean, reliable water when the wells went dry or the river turned foul, he wouldn't just be a craftsman. He'd become a threat to the influence the Grangers had held for generations. In a place where control over water meant power, Rick Boone had just introduced a game-changing variable. "You planning to sell these things?" Marcus asked, feigning a tone of casual curiosity while his thoughts raced through the implications. Rick met his eyes without flinching. "Planning to test this one first. See how it performs over time, figure out where it can be improved." Behind him, the mechanism continued its seamless operation. Gears spinning like the inner workings of a fine watch. Water emerging crystal clear in a steady stream. With every passing moment of flawless performance, Rick's credibility grew, and the Grangers' long-standing belief that he was just a harmless oddball eroded further. Rebecca watched the subtle exchange between her father and brother. Their glances said more than words ever could, a silent dialogue born from years of leveraging money and authority to shape outcomes. She recognized the look. They were assessing Rick Boone not as a neighbor but as a variable, a potential opportunity to exploit, or a growing threat that might need to be neutralized. What unsettled her most was the uncertainty of which conclusion they would ultimately draw. By nightfall, word of Rick's breakthrough had raced through town like lightning across dry prairie. Before the stars had fully claimed the sky, 3 more families had shown up to witness the strange device with their own eyes. Rick welcomed each visitor with the same calm demeanor. He offered no grand explanations, just invited them to observe. And what they saw spoke for itself. Muddy water went in. Pure, drinkable water flowed out. The system never faltered, never jammed. Gears turned without a hitch. Valves shifted effortlessly. The reliability of it all was undeniable. With each successful demonstration, Rick's reputation gained weight, and the Grangers' grip on influence slipped just a little further. Mrs. Patterson arrived just before the sun dipped below the hills, her husband in tow. She had heard whispers all afternoon, claims that seemed impossible until she saw for herself. Rick took a bucket of thick creek water and poured it into the intake. Moments later, the output spout delivered water so clear, so pristine it looked bottled. The automatic precision of the entire system impressed her, but it was the consistency that left a lasting impression. "How long would it take to build one of these?" she asked, her mind already calculating the benefits for her boarding house and its guests. "That depends on the size and what it's built to handle," Rick answered, turning a valve to shift the system's pressure settings. "This one took me about 3 weeks, working nights and weekends." Her husband crouched beside the machine, studying the gearwork with practiced eyes. "What happens if something breaks? These components are finely tuned. Seems like one issue could shut the whole thing down." Without a word, Rick reached over and disengaged one section of the gear array. The water flow shifted instantly, rerouted through a secondary network. The machine didn't even hiccup. "I designed it with built-in failovers," Rick explained, re-engaging the section with a quick lever pull. "Redundancy ensures it keeps running, even if something goes wrong." The demonstration left the Pattersons quietly impressed, and the growing crowd even more convinced that this wasn't just tinkering. This was innovation with intention. Multiple routes were built into the system to ensure it kept functioning, even during repairs or regular upkeep. It was a design rooted in resilience, and it impressed more with each passing moment. The number of spectators had swelled, with neighbors streaming in from across the valley. Whispers spread quickly. This was the most important invention their community had seen in a generation. Rick answered every question with measured patience. But Rebecca noticed a deliberate pattern in his replies. He spoke only of what could be observed: flow rates, configurations, gear operations. He never revealed the underlying design logic, the mechanical theories, or the deeper principles that powered the whole system. Back at the Granger Ranch, Virgil stood on his porch, arms folded, jaw tight. With every new visitor that passed by on horseback or wagon, his scowl deepened. The balance of social power in the valley was shifting beneath his feet, and at the center of it stood a man he had dismissed just days earlier as an eccentric nobody. "We need to act," Marcus said as he joined his father on the porch, his voice low but urgent. "People are talking about Boone like he's some kind of mechanical genius." "Maybe he is," Rebecca added, stepping out to join them. "And maybe we were too quick to mock him." Virgil's lips pressed into a thin, tight line. "Doesn't matter if we were wrong," he said coldly. "What matters now is that every rancher and shopkeeper from here to the hills is going to want one of those machines. And they'll pay Boone whatever he asks." None of them needed to say the rest aloud. The conclusion was obvious. Water was the lifeblood of every successful farm and business in the valley. Control over clean, dependable water meant control over everything: crops, cattle, livelihoods, and Rick Boone now held the keys to that control. The societal framework that had kept the Grangers perched atop the valley's power structure for over 2 decades was facing its first real disruption, and not from politics or economics, but from technology. That evening, as the last guests filtered away from Rick's land and the moon rose into a cloudless sky, the Granger family stared across the fields at a reality they never thought they'd face. Their quiet, peculiar neighbor wasn't just an inventor. He was a force of change. And change, especially the kind wrapped in gears and driven by ideas, had a habit of turning the world upside down. 3 mornings later, as the sun crested the hills, the next move came. Virgil Granger rode up to Rick's workshop, dressed in his best coat and carrying a weathered leather satchel stuffed with money. He dismounted with slow, deliberate flair, the way a man did when he was used to solving problems with his wallet. Rick was bent over his machine, performing routine maintenance, checking filters, adjusting gear spacing, recalibrating valves. Everything about his demeanor was calm, focused, deliberate. "Morning, Boone," Virgil called out, his tone polished and businesslike. "I've got a proposition for you." Rick looked up, wiping his hands clean on a cloth. His expression was neutral, unreadable, but he was listening. "I'm listening," Rick said evenly. Virgil flipped open the satchel, revealing a stack of bills, more money than most folks in the valley would see in a year. "Maybe 2. $500, he said, "for the whole setup and the plans to make another. Cash, right now." The offer lingered in the crisp morning air, heavy and unmistakable. $500 was no small sum. It was enough to buy a fine piece of ranch land, start a business, or retire early in most parts of the state. For a man who had shelled out $10 for a rusted-out safe, it was a fortune. "That's a generous offer," Rick replied calmly, his face unreadable. "Damn right it is," Virgil said, his tone thick with expectation. "More than you'll ever see again. You take the money, pack up your gear, and head off to find yourself a quieter patch of land. Live comfortable. No trouble." Rick strolled slowly around his machine, placing a hand on one of the copper pipes as it hummed softly beneath his fingertips. The water continued its smooth descent through the system, filtered, pressurized, and released in a steady, flawless stream. The gears ticked along like a well-rehearsed orchestra. No missteps, no friction. "What about the families who want one of these?" Rick asked, not looking up. "That's not your problem anymore," Virgil answered, his voice turning cooler. "I'll take care of distribution. Set fair prices. Make sure folks get what they need." Rebecca appeared at the edge of the clearing, still mounted, having followed the conversation from the tree line. She had feared this moment would come ever since she'd seen the unease settle into her father's face. The sight of the money bag confirmed her suspicions. This wasn't just business. This was control. "And if I say no?" Rick asked, adjusting one of the pressure valves with careful precision, as if discussing something as ordinary as weather. Virgil's polite tone evaporated, replaced by something heavier. "Then you'll find this valley isn't always the friendliest place for folks who don't play ball. Just something to think about." It wasn't an outright threat, but it didn't need to be. The Grangers held sway over land, water permits, bank accounts, and business networks. Life could get difficult fast for anyone who stood in their way. Most men would have taken the cash, thanked him, and left before nightfall. But Rick finished his last adjustment, stepped back and watched his machine run, clean water flowing strong, gears ticking smoothly, the whole system thriving without electricity, noise, or human effort. "I'm grateful for the offer," Rick said finally, voice steady, "but I think I'll keep refining it a bit longer. Still more to learn." The refusal landed like a slap. Virgil's face twitched just slightly, but the blow to his pride was unmistakable. He was a man used to getting what he wanted, and no one had said no to him in years, maybe decades. And now Rick had done it without raising his voice or lifting a finger. For the first time in a long while, Virgil was facing something that money and intimidation couldn't simply buy or break. Then the standoff was broken. The sound of hooves pounded down the lane. Mrs. Patterson galloped into the clearing, her face pale and strained, her horse foaming at the bit from the hard ride. Behind her rode 3 more townspeople, their urgency palpable. "Rick," she called, barely pausing to dismount. "Something's wrong with the main well. It went bad last night." Water's tainted, people are getting sick. Doc says it's not safe anymore. Virgil's complexion drained of color. The consequences hit like a hammer. This wasn't a theory anymore. This was happening, and Rick Boone might be the only one with a working solution. The town's central well was more than just a convenience. It was the backbone of daily life. It served most of the shops, the schoolhouse, and a large portion of homes. Without it, the entire settlement stood on the brink of a full-blown crisis, one that could drag on for weeks or longer while new wells were dug or emergency supplies found. "How bad is it?" Rebecca asked, her earlier concerns about family pride and influence evaporating in the face of a real immediate threat. "Bad enough," Mrs. Patterson replied, breath still shallow from the ride. "At least 20 folks are already sick. The doctor's doing what he can, but he told us plain we need clean drinking water and we need it now." Rick didn't waste a second. He strode to his machine and began adjusting the gear systems, recalibrating pressure valves with the swift, assured movements of someone who had rehearsed this many times before. "How many people are we talking about?" he asked. "Close to 300, another writer answered. "That's counting the farms outside town limits." The crowd watched anxiously as Rick modified his system, but it was clear to everyone that the small-scale unit, impressive as it was, couldn't possibly meet the demands of an entire town. Virgil opened his mouth, likely to point out the obvious shortfall, when Rick stepped away from the device and headed toward what most had assumed was just an ordinary storage shed behind his shop. Without a word, he threw open the double doors. Gasps filled the air. Inside stood 3 larger machines, each more intricate than the first. They were connected by a latticework of copper pipes, rotating wheels, and precision-engineered chambers. The interior of the shed resembled a mechanical heart, alive, complex, and humming with potential. Each system was a refined iteration of the original design, scaled up and integrated into a single network that stretched across the structure like veins and arteries. "I've been testing different setups," Rick said calmly as he began initiating the startup sequences. "Wanted to be sure the design could scale before I introduced it." Virgil and Marcus stared in disbelief, their earlier bravado silenced by what they were seeing. The contraption they had ridiculed had evolved into a full-fledged mechanical water purification facility, powered by pressure, movement, and ingenuity. No electricity, no chemicals, just physics and precision. Multiple intake pipes extended from the building, positioned to draw from creeks, storage barrels, or even runoff tanks. Inside the system whirred to life, cleaning, filtering, and routing water with astonishing speed and efficiency. This could supply the entire valley," Rebecca whispered, eyes wide with wonder. Rick gave a quiet nod as water gushed from several output points, clear and abundant. The flow wasn't just steady, it was substantial, vastly surpassing the volume of his first demonstration. The air around them buzzed, not with sound, but with a collective realization. Rick Boone hadn't just solved a problem. He had transformed the landscape of their lives, their livelihoods, and their future. "Designed it with growth in mind," Rick said, adjusting one of the intake valves as the system continued its smooth, powerful operation. "Population's been rising. Figured we'd need more capacity sooner or later." For the first time in years, perhaps ever, Virgil Granger was speechless. He stood frozen, staring at the facility before him, the bag of cash in his hands suddenly feeling embarrassingly small. The man he'd once dismissed as a naive tinkerer had just solved the valley's most urgent and long-standing problem. Not with talk, not with politics, but with action, with design, with vision. And while Virgil had spent his days guarding legacy and power, Rick had quietly been building the future. By midday, water was flowing to every home, farm, and business in the valley. No more boil warnings, no more sickness. The panic was gone, replaced by awe and relief. Rick Boone, the quiet man who had bought a pile of rusted metal for $10, had become the hero the valley hadn't known it needed. Not by seeking control or glory, but by doing the one thing no one else had done. He built a real solution. He didn't just protect what was his. He shared what he had created, and that changed everything. If this story moved you, click the video on your screen now to discover another unforgettable journey, where grit, invention, and heart come together in ways you'd never expect. And if you'd like to help us keep sharing inspiring stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe and consider sending a super chat. Your support makes all the difference.